Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I am a Catholic psychologist. I'm also the director of the Catholic Psych Institute. The Catholic Psych Institute was formed to heal the divide between the Catholic faith and psychology. And specifically, we do that by integrating Catholic philosophy and theology with sound, tested principles of psychology. I got my start as a Catholic psychologist really through my own conversion. When I was first coming to understand the faith, it was through the lens of John Paul II and his anthropology, specifically through love and responsibility, and then ultimately in the theology of the body. As I read Love and Responsibility, I really read it as a manual for psychology. I didn't really know what I was getting into yet at that point, and as I went further in my education, I realized that there's not much psychology founded on human truth. Most psychological theories out there are sort of shots in the dark, wondering and hypothesizing about what makes a human tick. Only by bringing together Catholic philosophy and theology do we create a foundation on which to rest every other advance into psychological research and theory. So that's what the Catholic Psych Institute does. It brings together all of these truths so that we can understand the full capacity of the human person based on who God created us to be. By having that model, we can then judge every disorder against it, and we can help people move closer to flourishing in their life. So I'll open it up first to any questions or thoughts from you. Go ahead. So how to deal with resistant couples who think they have all the answers already, and you're trying to work to get them to realize they don't. It's a great question. There's a bit of a trick there. I mean, doing a little study in psychology, a little study in marketing, I think goes a long way, understanding how to relate to people. Every situation is going to be different. Every personality is going to be different. But I think it's helpful, number one, if you think you have all the answers, you're already setting yourself up for failure pretty hard for marriage. And applying that mentality to each other, 6 months, 5 years, 10 years down the road, that's going to be disastrous when you kind of hit up against the wall. So I think it's helpful to point out immediately that having a bit of humility and openness to flexibility, adaptability, changing, thinking outside the box that you're used to is a really important, really central skill for marriage. And especially as a priest, you can offer your experience and wisdom, having walked the walk with so many couples before, having seen couples go through crisis, having witnessed the tragedy of divorce, and you can share from that position of expertise and say, I've heard that many times, and I've seen that in many couples. And unfortunately, all the couples that get divorced said the same thing when they got married. Nobody wants to get divorced when they start off on this journey. And it catches people by surprise. To their shock and horror, they end up thinking about divorce 6 months into marriage or 26 years into marriage. So it's, to try to sort of make it relatable in that way, I think you just have to find that angle to help them think outside the box a bit. And then, and then the next thing is, I guess an important point that I'd like to make to start is marriage prep needs to shift, I think, at least from what I've seen, away from sort of things about marriage to what marriage really is. When you're on the altar in front of friends and family and you're ministering the sacrament to each other, and you're filled with such beautiful thoughts and feelings, what if the words were a little different? What if instead you were saying to your spouse, I choose to die to self, to give you everything of myself until death do us part. I say yes, I do, to putting you first and me second, no matter how I feel, no matter what I think, no matter what I interpret to be right, until death do us part. If you change the words and all of a sudden you realize what you're actually saying, I think it'd be a little uncomfortable. And people start to shift in their seat a little bit. And so when it comes to marriage prep, there has to be this recapitulation that the one most important thing that matters is that you know that you're going to your death. And you know with joy that your death is the path to the resurrection. But that's what in working at home with the local church, that's what I tell people is my goal. If I can get couples to stand on the altar and know what they're saying when they say I do, I think that's enough. Talking about communication skills, finances, how you're going to deal with your in-laws, where you're going to go on vacation, how many kids you're going to have, like all of these things, that's part of marriage. That's not marriage prep. That's part of marriage. That's what Pope Francis says is day one of the apprenticeship. You're standing on the altar saying, I do. That's the beginning. But you have to know what you're saying. You're saying, I don't count myself first anymore. I've grown enough, discerned enough to know that I want to be first, therefore I'm going to be last. I want to live, therefore I'm going to die. If you want to save your life, you have to give it up. And so getting to the point of in psycho-spiritual sexual development, where you're ready to make that decision with this particular person, is what the entirety of marriage prep should be about. That maybe is a little radical, maybe it's a little naive and simplistic, but I would throw that out there. And if anybody wants to push back on it, please do. But that's when then marriage enrichment, marriage support, the continuation of the church providing resources, support groups, bringing people together in the communion of God, is then to say, okay, you've made the decision to die to self to your spouse, and now you're thinking and discerning about having kids. What does that look like? Now you have to deal with in-laws. What does that look like? And then that's going to be a continual development as the married couple lives and grows together. Going back to your question, the problem is human formation is terribly damaged. And people are coming out of families without being formed in just very basic human principles. I had the opportunity and the privilege to speak with members of church formation, seminary formation. And a lot of these men going into the priesthood are starting off already just really handicapped. And then it's the church has to make up for all the things that a family is supposed to be forming in the person. But whether you're going to the priesthood or to marriage, it's the same problem. Without the deep human formation that needs to occur in the family, then you show up and you're supposed to be making this gift of self, and you end up very handicapped. And then here we are to try to clean up the mess and help navigate those difficulties. So it's not so simple as just like, what's the zinger, what's the one-liner, what's the way to just get them in. I think helping them to understand that if you don't want to be divorced, it's important to step outside of the box and consider that there are other things for you to learn here. And just letting them know that every divorced couple thought they had all the answers in the beginning. I think at least that's a start. A lot of our focus is on marriage prep, and it's not on marriage sustenance or marriage maintenance. And again, I'll refer back to all the materials fresh in my mind. In priestly formation, there's a beautiful document on the formation of priests, and Pope John Paul II pointed out 4 pillars of development that were important for a man. And these are the same exact pillars of development that we could look at for everybody. And the first pillar is human formation. And then there's spiritual formation, intellectual formation, and pastoral formation. But he makes this point, and he says that for the priest, after ordination, formation does not stop. It's just beginning. Same as what Pope Francis says about marriage. The apprenticeship is just beginning. But when we focus all these resources on that first sort of anti-stage, it's really all about marriage prep, and then we don't really look at those other times of transition. So I work with couples or families, and whether it's marriage specifically or just other kinds of crises, and I'll have parents coming in because they're empty nesting, their kids are going off to university, or time even later in life with retirement. These are radical shifts in everything you've known about life. And the most immediate consolation that I give to these patients is to say, you're in it with everyone else. I've got 100 other patients just like you who are in that exact same position. It's really hard to shift your every expectation that you have about life, which has been built and based on what you're used to, and now the rug is pulled out from underneath you and everything is changing. Midlife crisis is another big one that I hear a lot about, going through certain transitionary periods like that. And if we don't have the preparation to know this is coming, that yes, this is going to be difficult, your world is going to be turned upside down, and you're going to feel like getting divorced. That is really helpful to protecting against actual divorce. Because then you're in the middle of it and you're like, man, this is really hard. Okay, maybe I made the wrong choice. Maybe we should get divorced. Oh, there it is. I had the thought, just like they told me I would. All right, let's go back to the resources or to the help, to the accompaniment that we've had along the way to get out of this rut. Instead of, let me keep thinking about whether or not I should be divorced. Even more so for children of divorce. This is another huge wound that is not unpacked nearly enough. I'm a child of divorce, and my wife is a child of divorce. When I was getting more serious about dating and discerning, and I was thinking about engagement, this was one of the most important conversations with her that I knew I had to have to find out if she's really going to be the right woman for me. And I said to her one day after a nice dinner or taking a walk down the street, I'm holding her hand, and I said, you know, if we get married, I'm going to want to divorce you. And she stops, squeezes my hand. What the heck do you mean by that? I said, well, that's the language I've been taught. And you're going to want to divorce me. Probably before I ever want to divorce you. Because that's the language you've been taught. So the word is in your vocabulary, and the thought is going to go through your head. But if we're going to consider actually doing that and joining together for life, then you need to know that my principle is that will never be an option. And that means that comes before anything, and there's nothing that will ever take that away. When we make that decision, if we make that decision, we're saying yes till death do us part without qualification. And I'm going to remove any grounds that we may have for annulment by having this conversation right now, because you know what you're getting into, I know what I'm getting into, and there's no backing out. And with tears, she said, yes, I agree. And she understood that that's her language also. When we don't have that awareness, when we don't shine the light on those transitions, those periods of time, those wounds, then those things sweep us away. And we find ourselves being rocked by life's conflict and tension, and that's where our mind goes, and that's what we think is the option, and we don't know what to do with it. So it's incredibly important to continue to talk about those things, flesh those things out, and understand that it's not just about finding the right partner. It's about knowing what wounds and what curveballs life can throw at you that are going to throw you off. So in speaking about marriage, especially in today's environment where there's so much controversy and there's so much debate, I think it's really important not to get pulled into the argument from the world's perspective. We don't need to answer the questions that the world is asking in the argument. Instead, what we need to realize is that the Catholic faith provides a vision of grandeur for the truth and beauty of what God created marriage to be. And if we can develop that, if we could really truly understand what that looks like, we will then provide something that the world didn't even know it was looking for. At the base of the human heart is the desire for greatness. And the answers that are coming from the world right now are not meeting those needs. But the Catholic faith, through this lens of psychology, theology, philosophy, following the teachings of the Church, offers something that will satisfy the heart's deepest longing. That is our responsibility as Catholics, to understand that and then to put it out there. That's how we evangelize the world. If we see in a very broad picture that sin is a mental illness, human brokenness, human imperfection is an illness in that sense, in a very generic sense. I'm moving away from actual psychological diagnostic impressions and codes and things like that, but we're all in the same boat together. We're all mentally ill to some extent. So I think, we have to understand that till death do us part, in sickness and in health, that means it's all in. So mental illness doesn't preclude us from making that decision. Now, again, speak with sensitivity here. There are severe mental illness situations. There is severe mental illness that may actually nullify the freedom that one has to make the decision to be married. And maybe we don't know that until further, retrospect. So that's definitely there, but we need to start off by assuming we're all mentally ill and we're all making the vow till death do us part, in sickness and in health. And so, if we start from there, then we're not sort of looking to see, have we crossed the threshold of mental illness so that we can say that this isn't going to work? And instead we're saying, how deep, how far does it really have to go? And it's never about, should we divorce or separate? Mental illness isn't gonna take away the reality of the marriage. Notice that I said it might have nullified the freedom to make that choice at the moment of the vow. So that's one category. Then we also have those cases where we have situations of abuse, we have situations of enabling, we have situations where we need to figure out how to intentionally either separate or create boundaries or do things that are for the good and the health of the marriage and the good and the health of each individual that's in the marriage. And so then that's when it gets a little more complex, and it really depends on the individual that you're walking with and discerning what is the right move here. I do a lot of work in Haiti, and in deep poverty we find this as well. And so there's all these variables, and people are waiting for qualifications and waiting to have enough money to have the certain kind of wedding and to have the certain kind of dress and all these things. And there's a bishop down there who's had incredible power in drawing people to the sacraments. And he's established as a rule for his parish. When he was a pastor, he had this rule for his parish that there is no wedding dress allowed. And so he just stripped the roadblocks from the process. And there was no wedding dress, and I forgot, they had like a very specific sort of regimen that was the same for everybody, whether they had money or not. And all of a sudden, the vocations went through the roof. To marriage, to priesthood, to the sacraments. People were coming back to confession. The Mass was jam-packed. And so, we see that's the trend, where people are not embracing the dying to self that needs to happen in marriage. The majority of people that I work with, that I know of, and that I support, they don't understand the marriage vow. And if they're hanging on by tooth and nail, it might be for some cultural reason, it might be for some familiar reason, it might be because they're trying to save things for the kids, and they're just waiting for the last kid to get off to college or to leave the house so that they can get divorced the way they've been planning on all along. And so we need that. That's why I'm saying the most important, and in my mind the only thing that's really important for marriage prep, is that when you say I do, you know what you're saying, and you're preparing for a life of ups and downs. But the vow is that you're going to stick together no matter what. When we talk about human formation precluding the vow, in canon law, it sets an age at which a person can marry, and now I forget if I think the girl's 13 for a female, 16 for a male. So that's not to say a 13-year-old should be married, but the interesting idea here is that you have to have the emotional maturity of a 13-year-old or a 16-year-old for the church to recognize that you have enough freedom to make a choice to enter into the sacrament of marriage. Think about that for a minute. How many annulments do you know of that are based on this idea of emotional immaturity? I didn't know what I was getting into. Did you have the emotional maturity of a 13-year-old? If you're a male, did you have the emotional maturity of a 16-year-old? We want to hang on this as an excuse, and we want to use this as just the Catholic option for divorce. And it's totally backwards. It's not what Christ has called us to. It's not the beauty of the vision of the sacrament and the call to holiness and the call to sainthood that we enter into through marriage. So with that being said, there are just a lot of handicaps that we go into this vow with, even if it's an appropriate vow or a valid vow. And so yeah, there's some really good programming. There's something that's just getting started that I've seen in New York. It's called the Human Dignity Curriculum, HDC. And this is a K through 12 education, which is meant to, it's philosophically based. So it gets into the anthropology of the dignity of the person, and it forms it from kindergarten up to 12th grade. And it's a response to the kind of education that's being promoted by Planned Parenthood. And so instead of having Planned Parenthood going into the school system and promoting their sexual values, they've come up with the antidote, or the oppositional program. So it's all about programming. That's one thing. The second thing, specifically about marriage, I've actually created a program in response to a lot of the data that I've seen in the work that I've done. So I have a course online called How to Be Married. And so you can access that at CatholicMindfulness.com. CatholicMindfulness.com is my sort of resource page with a number of different courses that I have. One of them is Introduction to Catholic Mindfulness. I could talk a little bit more about that as well. But one of them is How to Be Married. It's a new course that we just launched. And I go through component by component, talking about these different things, starting off with what I call the one thing that matters, which is all about self-sacrifice and dying to self, being a gift of self in the sacrament of marriage. And then we do break down into, communication and sort of meeting each other, understanding how to communicate with each other in a way that's human and respects the dignity of the person. Bless you. So, when it comes to human formation, that's, I think, practically speaking, the area that people are most lacking. And so we don't know how to listen to each other. We don't know how to step into somebody else's worldview. We don't know how to empathize, how to think about the idea that there might be another way to see something. The inability to think outside of your own box is a significant impairment of human formation that I find right now. And so developing communication means helping people to understand how to sit with and be present with another person without judging their perspective right away. In marriage work, I'll say to a couple, do you know how to listen to each other? And everybody, especially the men, are like, yeah, I know, you got to listen. Okay, great. So your mouth is shut. What's happening in your mind when your wife is talking to you? You're thinking about all the ways she's wrong. You're thinking about all the things that she doesn't remember correctly. You're thinking about your next argument and how you're going to shut her down and prove yourself right and prove her wrong. And you're thinking about, and it's coming from this a sense that the goal here is to win. And I'll remind a couple, that sounds a lot like the courtroom. You have your one position, and then you have the defense and the opposing side, and you have to present arguments. And this is a very masculine way to think about it. So men do this all the time. And then at the end of it, the judge comes down and makes a judgment. And even though a man doesn't want to lose the judgment, he accepts the terms, right? And we'll go into that, and we'll accept it. Okay, maybe I might be wrong. But when the plaintiff and the defendant are leaving the courtroom, how often do they go get a beer together? How often do they hug and shake hands and wish each other well? That's not what happens in the courtroom. So we need to shift our paradigm entirely. We cannot enter into communication as if it's an argument that we have to prove our case and win. Instead, we have to learn how to really sit with and be with the other person. And that's where the mindfulness comes in, because mindfulness is it's non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. And if your present moment is being in the presence of another person, that means it's non-judgmental awareness of the other person. John Paul II talks about this in Love and Responsibility. He calls it tenderness. If you like John Paul II and you like Love and Responsibility, it's right around page 200. It's a formative text for me in my work with couples. He said, you learn how to be with the other person emotionally, and you give the other person the impression that you feel what they feel and that you're with them. And you give them the sense that you're with them, that they're accompanied by a dear person, a dear friend. even when you're arguing.
We've had a wonderful time over the last 2 days being here at the Renaissance of Marriage. I think we've learned a lot as a couple to develop our own marriage, but also to learn skills to impart ministry with engaged couples in the parish, and it's been very fruitful and we're so excited to be here.
It is a really amazing opportunity to be able to witness to the world the love that God the Father has and that Jesus has for us.
Love the lineup of speakers, the different streams that we've been able to run with. We've enriched our own marriage and given tools to help engage couples. We've loved the opportunity to mix with other married couples who are journeying along the same lines as we have been. And it's been wonderful to have our bishops here with us, to journey with us and to share their insights as leaders of the Catholic Church in Australia. It's been wonderful.
As well as leading our vocation as marriage and making visible the love of Jesus for the church.
I'm Bishop Eugene Hurley from the Diocese of Darwin, which takes in the whole of the Northern Territory of Australia. And I'm delighted that Shalom Ministry is now in a position to bring some of that good news to the rest of Australia and indeed to the world. Because we live in a world where the media is so influential. It dictates so much of our learning and our attitudes. And so it's so important that the good news of Jesus Christ has to be made available to all people, because it's what we each need as human beings to enliven us, to make us more loving, and indeed to bring about peace in the world. So it's this good news that the Shalom Ministry is trying to get across to Australia now. And let me invoke God's blessing upon Shalom Ministry and all who work within it and all who are the subject of its good work. May the blessed Almighty God, Father, Son and Holy Spirit descend upon the Shalom Ministry and all who work in it and all their families. May keep them at peace forever. Amen.
Shalom World, God's own channel.